Now on BBC Radio 4, Speed, Greed and the M25. James May investigates a story long dismissed as an urban myth. A tale of 80s excess, dangerous driving and fast times in flash cars.
This radio station was named Kowalski.
People did rumour about races.
Speed means freedom of the soul.
I think they felt they ought to be races. It should be like Two-Lane Blacktop, Monty Hellman's film, or Vanishing Point.
"21 years ago this month, Mrs. Thatcher cut the ribbon on the final section of London's orbital motorway.
The world's longest ring road is a triumph of civil engineering.
It's terrific for Britain. It's one of the best highways in the world. So will you fly the flag for Britain? This is an achievement.
Rejoice, O ye people! More than a decade after it was begun, the M25 was finally complete. The two ends joined up, sort of. But what was it actually for? 117 miles of beautifully engineered blacktop that didn't actually lead anywhere. Because if you kept going, you arrived back where you started. A bit like a racetrack. Now there's a thought.
There are fears that young bloods in fast cars will use the M25 like a racing circuit and compete for the lap record.
Now you've got the message. This is a great engineering achievement.
The Chief Constable of Hertfordshire is ready for them.
We will be trying to discourage those who want to turn it into a racetrack, and we have got extra manpower to actually police it.
Back then, so the legend goes, the M25 at night was transformed into an illegal racetrack. Can this really be true? The idea seems absurd now. Too much traffic, too many cameras. But in 1986... well, I'm tempted to say that building a motorway in the shape of a big circle was sort of asking for it, really. But I'm still not sure I believe it.
It almost falls into the realms of the urban myth, but in actual fact it wasn't. They would meet at one of the service areas and off they would go, and it would be first one back.
I want to know if these races ever actually took place, who was taking part, and what they were driving. And the first clue comes from a book, London Orbital by Ian Sinclair. On page 141, I found a passage that sent me to a dreary car park on the northern edge of the motorway, from where I shall now read it to you. Time for breakfast. The South Mimms service station is our target. South Mimms was the first and for a long time the only pit stop on the circuit. City boys with loud shirts and floppy hair, pre-Hugh Grant, used South Mimms as a garage. A starting flag for a lap around London. Well, that's not how I've ever thought of it, to be honest. It's one of those new build service stations, the sort that looked like it went up overnight, made out of just plastic parts off the back of a lorry. And I tend to think of slightly manky cheeseburgers and blokes selling hooky watches out of the backs of cars. Not the illegal road racing.
If the M25 has a source, it's quite close to South Mimms, because Margaret Thatcher cut the ribbon very close to South Mimms, just a little way along the road. That's the sort of starting flag for this race around the road. You meet in the car park, and that is where the journey begins.
The crucial thing about this story is when it happened. Excuse me, do you mind putting this on for me? Track 2, thanks. See, what sort of person would actually be daft enough to buy a very exotic, very high-performance car and then drive it flat out round the M25? A banker in the 80s.
There were rumours in the early days that there were these sort of city boys using the road to race on at night, particularly because it kind of came with that expansion of the financial markets and Dockland growing up, and then this could have been the kind of equivalent of handbrake turns on housing estates. This is it for the rich who could try out their new toys blasting around this road. So it was sort of a projection into the London landscape of what was happening financially and architecturally to the city. But I never came across one single person who was able to tell me about it.
The idea that the City Boys went off and just roared around the M25 all night actually makes some sense to me. And they needed to burn off their adrenaline, they needed to get rid of the stress and the insane competitiveness that they lived with. All the sort of qualities that probably made you a very brilliant dealer or trader, and the sort of qualities that would probably drive you to go and take your new fast car and rag it round the M25. It was a sort of chariot racing around the capital. Right, I think it's time to head somewhere I've never really been before. The city.
I first started working in the city in 1982 when I was 21.
Author and ex-city boy Michael Ridpath.
I was trading American bonds and American junk bonds, and that was really fun.
The car of choice at that stage was the Porsche.
Justin Urquhart Stewart.
I do recall one evening actually watching some Porsches overtaking what looked like more as an open truck, and in the truck were plastic bags full of share certificates, and I thought it summed it up really rather well.
There was nowhere else where you could earn so much money so quickly.
David Charters also worked in the city in the late 80s.
The first time I had £1 million bonus, you could have heard the Aliulu chorus going off in my head. It was extraordinary.
In 86, it was that feeling that, well, you can achieve anything you like, and frankly what happens to everybody else is almost beside the point.
1986, let me think. I lived in a fairly shabby flat above a television dealer in Chiswick in West London. I did have a car. It was a Mini Clubman 1100, not the weedy 850 version. I was a recent, rather lost music graduate. I worked at a car dealership for a bit. I was fired from that. I worked in a hospital in the records office. I worked at a factory that made razor blades. I knew there were people my age and even younger working in this thing called the city. It was some sort of glittering palace where I never actually went, but where there was this huge party going on for all the very rich and successful people. And they were all essentially drunk on the tipple of the moment, which was actually petrol.
People wanted fast cars, probably faster cars than they were able to drive, and so Porsches, Ferraris, Aston Martins.
Fast cars. Well, the baby banker of the 1985 or 6, the first car we all got was a Golf GTI, or a Golf GTI 16 valve, because that's what the car allowance stretched to.
1980, I served my apprenticeship.
So you must have remembered then those sort of heady days when GTI after GTI came through the doors for a service, and possibly to have a few dents knocked out as well.
For sure, yeah. There was, I suppose, thinking back, they were all driven by the young city types, you know, just like to hear about them.
I've come to one of the few car dealerships located in the city itself, Allendale Volkswagen. Francis Porter worked here in the glory days. Now, did you ever hear, back in the mid-80s, any rumours about illegal road racing around the M25?
We've certainly heard about it, but no, I don't recall too much information.
You don't know anybody who did it?
No, I don't. No.
Sure?
No. No, I don't.
I worked in the city for 12 years and never heard stories of people racing around the M25.
David Charters again.
People who were earning a lot of money, £1 million bonuses, doing very, very well financially, wouldn't have wanted to do something that would jeopardise their position.
But Justin Urquhart Stewart has different memories.
Throughout 86 and 87, there were some fairly distinct rumours and almost invitations for people to take part in races in the M25. In those days, of course, you didn't have email that we had now, but there were sort of unofficial invitations that if you went out to South Mims, there might be a party going on there. I never took part in them and never even actually witnessed them. Do I think they took place? Oh, yes.
I'm on my way to see a man called Mark Wood. These days he leads a blameless life, but back in the 80s he was a city boy. I sent him an email and I said, we want to come and talk to you about the M25 and the illegal road racing. We're pretty sure it's an urban myth, but we'd like to talk to you about it anyway. And he's written back very succinctly, Delighted to help. It's not a myth.
The race. It isn't.
So it was properly organised. We're not talking about people just going out for a bit of a burner. These were organised competitive events.
Well, I mean, there were several round the M25 in the early hours of Saturday morning runs. I don't think they were, strictly speaking, competitive before the cars were switched on, but they certainly got competitive towards the end.
And was there prize money?
No. I mean, honour was the key thing, I think.
Right.
So I don't think there was anything official going on, but it is certainly the case that there would be Sunday morning full laps, and the honour was often reflected in quite substantial, mostly liquid. I mean, certainly the recollections I would have was that there's plenty of vintage champagne exchanged hands, but I'm not sure there was, or maybe there was a kitty on one occasion, but I think it was more of a kitty than a prize pot offered by somebody.
So it was everybody throws in and then the winner takes all.
Yes.
But was it groups of cars actually racing a lap, or what, did people do it against the clock?
It was a timed event.
We're talking about people averaging well over 100 miles an hour.
Oh yes, yes. The second badge of honour I seem to remember is less than 60 minutes, and then there was some quite serious cars running around and quite a lot faster than that.
This is the difficult question, but did you do it?
Well, I mean, it's rather like reading pornography, isn't it? I know friends who certainly have access to.
It's for my mates.
Exactly.
Moment, isn't it? Yes. You're not saying you ever took part in these races?
Good heavens, no. I mean, I was working far too hard at the time.
But you can absolutely, categorically confirm that it did go on.
I heard very convincing rumours. It's far from a myth.
You knew the people involved?
I saw some of the cars afterwards.
Right, okay. We were at the nub end of an era in which speed on the road was still very, very glamorous.
Everything has changed.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it is a completely different era. I mean, there were a lot of horrific accidents in these cars, particularly in wet weather on the for the 911. I mean, I think we're in a far, far safer era today.
So the risks were points on your licence, possibly a very, very large fine, maybe even imprisonment, and even an untimely death if you got it all horribly wrong. So why would you risk all of that just to drive fast on what is, in the end, a motorway? Well, I suppose it helped if you were young, you were delirious with your newfound wealth, and you just didn't care. I wonder, though, if it's also got something to do with the thrill of driving on an empty road at night, when all the normal associations we have with the motorway, of the drudgery and the ennui of just plodding along mile after mile through the usually slightly miserable landscape, all that's replaced by a sense of magic and wonder, because there are lights and there's cool air and darkness, and you can see less, but the whole place seems to come alive.
The M25 at night is something else. It's rather wonderful. I kind of think of it as a Sumerian starscape glittering there when the weather's just right. This shimmering, jeweled snake of light with that double light, the orange light and the red light, the two streams into play, and it's magic and far away from the notion of stop-start grunge dribble that would come with the first light of morning when you were coughing up the diesel fumes once more.
Possible breakthrough here. I've got a copy of a news story from the Times in the late 80s, and it talks about how the police have uncovered a plan to stage an illegal road race on London's orbital motorway. It has quotes from Police Sergeant Eric Locke, who says that he knows from sources that people are coming from abroad to enter in Ferraris and Porsches, and Chief Inspector John Kennedy, who says we're taking it very, very seriously. It's not only crass stupidity, but incredibly dangerous. And this report was filed by the Times' cub reporter, one Boris Johnson. Not much has been heard of him since.
We started to notice posters and flyers appearing, and in our local Enfield Gazette there was also an advertisement quoting a PO box number.
Retired police officer Eric Locke.
I consulted with Chief Inspector Jack Kennedy, and we began then to take this matter quite seriously. We also got information from other police stations within the metropolitan area and also in the home counties, suggesting that there was going to be this race held at midnight, probably on a Saturday night, to do albeit the M25, obviously at high speed.
Chief Inspector Kennedy, no stranger to the aftermath of fatal road accidents, was only too aware of the potentially devastating cost of such a race.
It's a great leveller standing in the identification suite of a public mortuary with a relative, loved one, near one or dear one, and pulling back a cover and seeing someone that you love dearly lying lifeless.
We contacted the local paper, and through that we traced a man who we believed was responsible for organising this race. His house was searched and he was arrested, and we seized the application forms. We nipped it in the bud.
Some of the application forms had been filled in.
They were invariably high-powered, high-performance sports cars. The classic Ferraris, souped-up M3 BMWs, cars of that nature, which obviously could exceed 130, 140 miles an hour.
If you can imagine a vehicle travelling in excess of 100 miles an hour, going airborne, the driver or a passenger is catapulted from the vehicle. The injuries are horrific. There is no chance of survival, no matter how quick the emergency services get to the victim, no matter how skilled surgeons and doctors may be, there's just no chance of survival. I recall in the 80s going to a fatal accident on the motorway. The young lad had been travelling so fast that he went up the embankment, the car was airborne, it went over a fence, no chance of survival, and the next time his relatives saw him was in the mortuary.
Sergeant Byrne.
Tony Byrne.
Hello.
James, pleased to meet you.
And you.
Sergeant Tony Byrne patrols the M25. Lucky man.
If you're actually convicted of racing on the highway, you're looking at a lengthy ban.
Could you go to prison?
Possibly, yes. You know, you've got to be daft to try and do the fastest time around the motorway, because you're going to get certainly some points on your licence by going through the average speed cameras.
What about in, say, 1985? Because there were no Gatsos then. I don't think there was any surveillance then. There were only traffic cops, weren't there?
I'll take your word for that, James.
And I think, but also, even if there were video cameras, I think in 86 video evidence wasn't admissible, was it?
No, the video cameras would have been solely for surveillance and looking at the traffic conditions.
Right. So it would have been possible to do a fast lap of the M25 and stand some chance of getting away with it?
Yeah, anything's possible, yes.
When people tell me about these supposed M25 races, they make it sound quite glamorous, really, and the roads are empty, so it's not really very dangerous. What's your view on all that?
Well, I go to the crashes where it all goes wrong. The faster you go, the bigger the crash.
The right place to go racing is a racetrack. So I went to Silverstone during a corporate track day, hoping to find real petrol heads, the sort of people who could nail this rumour.
I have heard the words M25 and racing in conjunction, but these are things that I've heard other people do, particularly in the late 80s.
Yeah, definitely. I heard people not just racing, but trying to see who could do the quickest lap of the whole M25. And I don't know who won, but I wasn't involved. So, but yes, I certainly heard of it.
In amongst the fast cars, I found Roger Blake, a man with vivid memories of the mid-1980s.
It did actually exist. There are people there that were members of the M25 club. It was an unofficial club, and it was for people with fast cars. It was, it was no good in your Golf GT. We're talking Ferraris, Porsches, Lamborghinis. It was that sort of thing, and they would meet, and they would meet at one of the service areas, and off they would go, and it would be first one back, and there would be one car usually sitting at the halfway point, so wherever they set off from, there would be a car sitting at the halfway point to make sure that people actually did go past it, because then there was no cheating. You weren't sort of going to do a cut off. But yeah, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, it was empty. It was like a giant Silverstone, and it was used as a giant Silverstone. No cameras. Wonderful. Let's go for it, lads.
There was one tricky bit. For one section in the east, the M25 wasn't strictly a motorway at all. It was an A road, the Dartford Tunnel.
Half of the fun of getting through the Dartford Tunnel was getting the right gate to get through. It was picking the gate. That was almost like a pit stop in a way, an enforced pit stop in motor racing, where you have to come in and you have to change your tyres and be quick. The Dartford Tunnel was almost looked upon as a challenge, where you had to get through the tunnel as quickly as possible. So your gate selection of who wasn't going to get out the £10 note to pay the 20p passage or something like that, and that was part of the fun, was getting through the tunnel as quickly as possible. And the tunnel again, that was reminiscent of Monaco. You're racing through the tunnel. That was windows open to hear your engine going as you went through the tunnel. Oh dear, it sounds like I've done it, doesn't it?
Does a bit, yes. So how does Roger know so much about it?
I had a friend that did it. I think so. I never actually did it myself, but I had a friend that actually did it. So it existed. It's not an urban myth. That period was the yuppie period. What you had then was you had large city bonuses being paid, and people went out and bought fast cars, and they wanted somewhere to drive them.
But a year after the M25 was completed, those city bonuses were suddenly under threat.
The city has been gripped by panic on the grand scale for much of the day. Share prices have suffered their sharpest ever fall in one session.
Black Monday, October the 19th, 1987.
There was panic in the markets today. It was a bloodbath.
There are a lot of worried people in the city.
No, I would think very. Yes. Not merely worried about their investments, but also quite a lot of people worried about their jobs.
And their cars.
I think the crash left people psychologically bruised. There had been this great mood of confidence, the sense that nothing could go wrong, the great money machine was going on and it wouldn't ever stop. And suddenly it did, and how? And it was brutal and it was dramatic, and people lost their jobs, and people who'd built lifestyles based on expectations of enormous bonuses suddenly found life coming to a juddering halt.
I've now left the M25 near Sevenoaks, driving into the sticks, coming to see a man who remembers the end of the 80s very well. In fact, he has some of it.
I can remember going out and investing, at the time I think it was about 15k in a car of mine, which halved overnight.
As a Porsche owner, Paul Devier saw prices go into freefall as Black Monday put the brakes on the boom and former city traders waved goodbye to their flash cars. As a Porsche dealer, it was a bit of a turn-up.
When I started my business, I actually started after the big crash. It was a good point for the Porsche specialist. There was an overabundance of cars of that sort of era available, and at prices that were a lot lower than they had been.
Why do you think it became that you got a successful job in finance or in the city or in one of the big insurance brokers or the stock market and all the rest of it? The badge of office was a high-performance car. Now, I know that's not a thing that's peculiar to the 80s, but it was particularly rampant in the 80s.
I think it was the accessibility of these type of cars for the first time. And I grew up, when I was a kid, my father had 356 Porsches. If you've led a life around machines like that, then you're always going to have this hankering. But I do know that the Thatcher years, even for me, they sort of brought a new wealth as prices had soared to a point where I actually bought my first Porsches all out of the mortgage, even though I didn't have a job at the time.
How much is this red one that you've got? How much
is for 16,000.
Let's take it for a spin, just to make sure it's as good as you say it is.
I'll get the keys.
By 1987, the party was coming to an end. The 80s had peaked, but this bright red Porsche is a fitting monument to the era.
No, don't go too fast. 915 gearbox.
It was a car with something of a reputation as a tricky beast. If you drove one of these, it must mean you were really good, not just at driving, at everything. And they were red, minty green, yellow. During a boom, new cars are colourful. In more cautious times, dark, sober hues are more popular. After the crash, the stock market crash, the money markets recovered fast, but plenty of young city workers saw their careers washed away. By 1988, a whole new generation would be orbiting the M25, in search of illegal raves and a different kind of fun, driving round London at a slower, hazier pace. Ecstasy replaced the adrenaline-fueled rush of the M25 racers. But it's hard to associate the motorway of today with any sort of joy or excitement or beauty, although Ian Sinclair thinks he may have found some.
There are moments, there are fleeting senses, particularly the 2 points where you cross the Thames, when you come over the Queen Elizabeth II Bridge and you're suddenly up there, suspended in space. And the other one, when you cross the Thames at Staines, you don't even notice when you're on the road. You don't even see that you've done it. But when you're down below, should you go down beneath that, the bridge underneath, it is an absolutely magical space, because you've got the sound of the road, a sort of acoustic chamber that is probably the most magical space in the whole circuit of the M25.
I'm scrambling down a muddy path at the side of the M25 to get myself under Ian's favourite bridge, see what it is he's on about. Right, so that's it. What did he call it? A magical place and an acoustic chamber. Let's have a listen and see what we think. I can hear a lot of traffic, fractious, noisy, frustrated. Not getting much of a sense of magic, to be honest, Ian. It's more of a sense of sharp-suited executives in diesel hatchbacks talking on hands-free phones, looking at satellite navigation screens and going off to a conference about the future of plastics or something. What this is the sound of UK PLC, as Lord Young would have called it, at work. It's all very businesslike and serious. It's exactly what Mrs. Thatcher would have wanted. But I wonder if somebody like me was here 20 or more years ago at night, then it would have been almost completely silent because the motorway would have been empty. And then in the distance you might have heard the rising rumble of the 911's unmistakable air-cooled flat six, or maybe the wail of a 12-cylinder Ferrari on full sol. And that would have been the sound of something illicit and forbidden and dangerous, yes. None of that sort of thing. I bet all the cars are grey and silver and dark blue.
Speed, Greed and the M25 was presented by James May and produced by Julia Adamson.